I don't know which book you selected for your, but when you look at them, there's really such strong similarities between all of them. It's almost silly that there's such a variety of books out there,
Right.
and that they're so expensive. It is a business. I'm not sure how that business is going to keep going when universities themselves are pushing us to use online resources that are, if not cheaper, at least maybe even free for students. And really, all this information has been out there since Aristotle. So if you go to Aristotle's original website, he's got everything there. Of course, it's in Greek. And keep in mind that Abraham Lincoln famously said, "You can't trust everything you find on the internet."
Right.
Of course, they saw that on the internet. So the first thing to do is to talk about what the heck logic is. And the easy answer to that is, well, it's recognizing good arguments, learning to recognize the logical patterns in good arguments, which will help you in everyday life, but especially if you get into law and politics, where up until recently it used to be the case that people had to be logical. And it was considered an asset to be logical. Now, I'm not so sure. But in any case, while that's the easy answer to what logic is, the harder question really is, well, are those systems of logic that we've used so successfully, and that's pretty obvious, especially when you look at the history of science as well as the history of thought, you can see that there has been amazing progress. I mean, compare a jet engine to a stone wheel. And actually, I don't know that, stone wheels, did they really exist? How do you move a stone wheel?
Need a sharpen axe.
The progress is obvious, and so that leads us to believe that our logical systems are powerful and correct. And what does that mean? That means that they are associated with the way the world actually works. And what is that? That's especially Aristotle's law of contradiction. He called it the law of contradiction. All our contemporary books refer to it as the law of non-contradiction, because basically, what he's pointing out is you can't have a thing and not a thing at the same time. We're eating. We're still much heavier on Zoom than in person. But so I'm going over basically a quick summary of the course, but if you have any questions, please feel free. The law of contradiction, as he called it, but we always translate it as non-contradiction, because you can't have a thing be what it is and not what it is at the same time, in the same respect. By the way, in a contemporary sense, that's the biggest problem people have with I was going to say Europeans, but it's not just Europeans. It's definitely a part of our culture as well today, and that is, the issue of alternative facts.
Oh my God.
Right? Because in a linguistic way, there's excuses for that. But when we go back and we look at Aristotle's laws, really laws of thought, the law of contradiction is one, and identity, a thing is what it is, and not another thing. If you're, I remember Aristotle's explanation at one point is, if somebody's arguing with you to the contrary of that, saying that a thing is what it is, but it's also not what it is, you can't argue with that person, right, because they're arguing with themselves. So there's no point in getting involved and trying to help that person. I usually would joke and say that, for Aristotle, that would mean you just have to shoot them,
Yep.
That's the solution. But no, that's a joke. And actually, that's, especially after what happened last week,
Oh yeah, you can connect those two.
the CEO being shot,
Yeah.
and now Luigi. Luigi is a real name, apparently, for Americans.
Interesting. I would think Italian, yeah.
Well, he's Italian ancestry,
Right.
well-to-do, apparently. But I didn't want to get stuck on that. But I shouldn't joke about, well,
Right.
you have to just shoot them.
I think that
Because
is
that, I always had meant that to be just a joke. And obviously, there's plenty of people that have taken that seriously. And it's not like dueling is allowed,
Oh,
you know?
could you imagine?
You could lose possible presidents that way, you know? So the question then is ancient Greek logic so closely attuned to the way the world works that logic, as we think of it in that sense, is the way the world works? Well, of course, what ends up confusing that whole case is discovering, and so another aspect of trying to figure out what logic is the question about language. Well, wait a minute. The clear bias that we have in thinking about Greek logic and what has become basically the European languages, for the most part, who follow the structure of Greek language and have the same kind of grammar, which, notice, there are other languages in the world among the 7,000 some human languages that are not structured that way. And so it becomes obvious to us that we might be looking at a bias that is, coming from the language most people taking a logic course speak, and recognizing that there are other languages out there that don't see things in categorical terms, so that the idea that a thing has an identity that can be associated with a particular linguistic expression, this is a cup, even Hegel will tell you, well, it's not only a cup, it's also all the things that are not cup in a understanding of the full sense of the word, because not only do I know this is a cup, I also know that it's not a car, it's not a boat, it's not a Bugs Bunny, it's not a, and that's part of knowing that it is a cup, is knowing all the other things that it's not. But in some sense, well, it's also a whole bunch of particles and an arrangement. So in some sense, my conceptual way of thinking about objects, in some levels of thinking, is incomplete, at least. I wouldn't necessarily say it's incorrect, but to say that there are other aspects to things that another way of speaking means that that's totally incomplete to talk about it as a solid object. Theoretically, these particles and my particles permeate one another. It's not a solid, barrier. So the question about language becomes a serious issue, and I haven't resolved that for myself, because I don't have enough experience linguistically with 7,000 languages out there. And our society has come to realize that ethnic groups, linguistic groups, have developed in context of their environment a strength that individuals coming from a different context don't have. And so there's at least a lot of importance to recognizing all those other languages, learning what those languages offer. And that's why our society as a very modern, accepting society, and realizing how important languages are, often starts out by pointing out we respect, the people that used to live here, and we value the way they explained the nature of nature, and how they lived with it. Even to the extent that their narration is very different than, say, European narration. You might not even have a beginning, middle, and end. All European stories, can I say that? I haven't checked every single story, but for the basic, monomyth kind of thing, you have, the beginning. Contemplate the Big Bang. A lot of people, when talking about our favorite models of the universe, one of the things that people will say, even though it surprises me, is the Big Bang model is what they really find interesting. Remember, Aristotle actually didn't think there was a beginning. Aristotle thought, that there was a continuous, that nature, was the way it was and always was that way. He doesn't contemplate kind of a beginning and an evolution of species or anything of that sort. He does talk about a beginning in the sense of the prime mover, but the prime mover has always been doing the prime moving. So the reason the air moves and the planets move and the sun and the stars move is all because something out there that's the prime mover that's moving everything has always been doing that. So it's not like for Aristotle the prime mover created the universe. It's what makes the universe move,
Right.
essentially, as I understand him.
Right.
But the idea of creation ex nihilo, from nothing, that there's a beginning. Some people point to the Genesis, to the Bible, and say that's clearly God created the world. Well, if you read that, at least the varieties of stories in Genesis, God is stirring above the waters. So the waters are already there first, right? And then he pulls up the dry land and stuff, and light. He creates light, and that's pretty interesting, because that seems to be very close to what, of course, scientists would say today, is that you start off with light. And everything is light, actually.
You can't help it.
Even what we think of as solid is actually photons in motion, which is what light is. It's just that we typically think of light, as from this frequency to this frequency, but actually, if what decides that, the human eye, what we perceive, or what
That's
snakes
part of
perceive, or
light is,
so anyway, if we're trying to figure out what logic is and connect the dots to the universe, is logical because the universe is logical. In the same way, we don't really have an answer to that question. And as a result, we do really value more and more other ways of seeing things. That doesn't mean that we don't trust logic, but that there's more to the universe and more to human experience than what you might typically get in a Western educational model of the old sort, right? So what does logic study? Well, the concept since Aristotle, but today, of course, the picture is much broader and more interesting, actually. So, but then we do have to focus on Aristotle, because, of course, what I've discovered in my life, I've been spoiled rotten because I had logic back in 1970, which was probably before you were born, if logic works that way. So I've been, like, well, duh, true and false is a statement that, does this or that, and, right, from college on, I always thought, well, that's clearly true. What I discover, of course, by meeting other people that haven't had the benefit of that kind of experience is that a lot of people don't realize that that's how true and false statements work. So that becomes an important part of a logic course, because if I'm not going over that stuff, you're not getting what you're supposed to, that you just paid for, right? And it is kind of funny, that, wait a minute, we get into all these arguments. Is that true? Well, there's actually